Hey, welcome back to Chapel, Brentwood Academy Middle School students. This is our fourth and our final segment in the Upside Down. As we've been going through, we've been looking at various scriptures and seeing how the way God made the world is not how the world is now, right? We looked at Romans 12:2 early on, and then we've been going through the book of Matthew, and we looked at the Beatitudes. And this past week, we looked at the verses where Jesus tells us, "You have heard it said, but I tell you." Well, this week, we are going into a story. And this is a story of a family, and specifically the youngest daughter in this family, who lives their life in a way that is completely unlike the world around them, right? This is what it looks like to follow the teachings of Jesus and be citizens of the kingdom while living in the Upside Down. Our story starts with a man named Casper ten Boom. Casper ten Boom is living in Holland. He is a famous watchmaker throughout the country. He's so good at his job, literally every week he takes a train to Amsterdam so he can set the perfect time according to the Naval Observatory there. And then he travels back and he conducts his business. He's a devout Christian family man. He has a wife, he has 4 children, Willem, Nolly, Betsy, and the youngest, Corey. And Corey actually is going to follow in her father's footsteps, and she's going to become the first female watchmaker of Holland. But she'll do much more than that. Also, during coffee breaks at his business, Casper is going to have Bible studies with his family and his employees. This is a picture of a devout Christian man who's leading his family business in the right way. And his business building also doubles as his home. So the bottom floor is where the watchmaker shop is, and then above is the family home. Well, as the family gets older, some relatives get sick. Corey's aunts aren't really able to take care of themselves anymore, and so Casper wants to bring them into the home. But the home just isn't big enough, so he buys the building behind their house. But he doesn't want to have 2 different homes, so he conjoins those 2 buildings into one home. But here's the thing, like there's an alley that separates them, and the floors aren't even at the same level, right? And so what happens is there's going to be some very odd spaces that go unused, which becomes an important part of the story later. Well, May 10th, 1940 comes along. And if you're paying attention and you know a little bit about history, Europe, 1940, some World War II alarm bells should be going off. The Prime Minister of Holland on that day, he gets on the radio and he announces that the Nazis have invaded their country. 5 hours later, bombing begins to destroy the city of Amsterdam, and the country of Holland and the ten Booms and everyone are now brought up into World War II, something that they didn't think would hopefully happen to them. Later on, Corey ten Boom is sleeping in her bed when the bombing that's taking place not far away wakes her up, and she just can't go to sleep, so she goes and gets a cup of tea. And when she comes back, she's feeling to get in her bed, and something really sharp actually injures her hand. Turns out it was a piece of shrapnel from a bomb. What's really interesting about that is it was right where her head would have been on her bed, and she comes to the conclusion that had she not been awoken and gone and got that cup of tea, she would have died right there in her sleep. And perhaps the thought comes into her head that there's maybe a reason that she was spared that night. Well, Corey and her family often talked about what they could do as the situation worsened in Europe. You see, as the Nazis were pushing in to Holland and the other parts of Europe, the persecution of the Jews was growing and growing. And what Corey mentions in her book that she eventually writes is this. She says, "We talked often, Father, Betsy, and I, about what we could do if a chance should come to help some of our local Jewish friends. Each month, the occupation seemed to grow harsher, restrictions more numerous." Right? It's fascinating. Her thought is not, we talked often about how we could escape the brutality of the war. We talked often about how we could protect ourselves from the Nazis. No, we talked often about how we could help our Jewish friends. That's an important distinction. I want you to think in this story, there's going to be a lot of moments when we see Corey and her family living a completely opposite way from maybe what's instinctive in all of us, right? Well, this idea of helping fight back the Nazis and sheltering, protecting the Jews. It's not just something that Corrie and her father are thinking about. The whole family's thinking about it. Her brother Willem, he joins the resistance. Her father Casper actually takes notice of the plight of the Jews, and something that's going on with the Jews is the Nazis want to mark them publicly, visibly, so that it's easy to see Jew from non-Jew. And so they make them wear these yellow stars, what we call the Star of David, right? It's actually the symbol of the Jewish faith. And Casper is not a Jew. He's a Christian. But he wears one of these stars in order to communicate to the Jews, I see you, I care about you, I'm looking out for you. But it also puts a target on him as well to do this. One day, a Jewish woman and her small child approach Casper, and they're trying to escape the city before they're captured by the Nazis. And Casper approaches a clergyman and says, hey, can you sort of smuggle them to your home outside the city? And he says, no, he can't. It's too dangerous. And this is something really interesting that Casper says. He goes, speaking to the clergyman, he says, you say we could lose our lives for this child. I would consider that the greatest honor that could come to my family, right? The idea of losing his life, he considers that something desirable almost, because it would be in the service of protecting those who could not protect themselves. Well, what we see sort of emerges out of this is a campaign by the Ten Booms to use what they have, what God's given them, to protect the Jews. They turn their watchmaking shop into the perfect front for a Jew hiding and smuggling outside the city operation. And they begin to speak in code, right? What we hear them say is, I have a watch in need of repair, from different people who will come and visit their shop, right? And what these people are really saying is, hey, there are some Jewish children, some mothers, some families who are trying to escape. Can you fix this watch? I have a watch in need of repair, right? And they're speaking in code because they know that the Nazis have an eye on them, right? And they have a hunch that their house is even being bugged. Their telephone lines are being watched. There is this great sense of danger that what they're doing could get them killed. But nonetheless, they dedicate themselves to this task. Now, I talked to you about the house, and I said there were two homes conjoined, right, to make room for the elderly aunts who moved in. Well, one of the areas where we see God's providence is that there is this space behind Corrie's bedroom that was actually large enough to hold several people. But because of the way that the walls have been put up, you couldn't tell that there's an extra space there. And that became a hiding room, a hiding place for the Jews who were brought into the home and awaited their time before they could be taken outside of the city. And over the course of many months, a few years, the Ten Booms actually were able to bring to safety around 800 Jews from their city of Haarlem and the surrounding areas. Really, really an incredible impact they had on those people, all at the risk of their own lives. Well, that risk didn't go, it didn't go well. They ended up paying a price for it, right? One day, a man shows up asking if he can borrow some money to help bribe the police to get his Jewish family to safety. And he turned out to be more of a spy than a man in actual need, it would seem. And he informed the Nazis, and they raided the home. And Corrie, her father Casper, and Betsy, Corrie's sister, they're all going to be taken off to prison. And in prison, it's going to be a while where they sit. Eventually, Corrie's going to get a letter from another family member, and she finds out her father is dead. He has died in prison, and that's going to break her heart a little bit. But there's going to be worse things to come. After a time in prison, Betsy and Corrie are going to be taken out of there, not back home. They're going to be taken to an all-women's concentration camp, a place called Ravensbrück. Okay? And in Ravensbrück, this is a place where these women, mostly Jews, but since Corrie and Betsy were helping the Jews, they're also going to be punished alongside them. They're going to be doing free labor. and the conditions of Ravensbrück are awful. Very little rations, terrible sleeping facilities. In fact, the barracks where they're going to have to spend the night every night is full of fleas. Okay? And during the time that they're there, they're going to have an incredible impact on their community. They actually smuggle in a Bible to this place, and the Bible is completely outlawed, right? They can be punished severely. But with that Bible, they begin to sort of host Bible studies for the other women in this barracks. And they find it interesting that the guards never show up in their barracks. They consider it maybe some protection from God somehow. But they find out later, the guards intentionally avoided their barracks because the fleas. They knew that place was flea-ridden, and it would seem that even through fleas, God protected and blessed the efforts of these two sisters. Well, one day, because of the overwork and because of the lack of rations, Betsy gets sick and she's unable to do her job and meet her work quota. One day when the prison guards comes over, and he begins to beat her and beat her and beat her. And Corrie sees this, right? And you can imagine how you feel if someone begins to beat your sibling nearly to the point of death. Well, Betsy doesn't die there, but she goes to the hospital within the camp, which isn't much of a hospital at all. And eventually, she does die there, and it's not much later. And Corrie is pretty heartbroken over that. And in some communication that Betsy has with Corrie, she says, "Corrie, if people can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love. We must find the way, you and I, no matter how long it takes." Just think about that worldview, right? You've been taken out of your home. Your father has died in prison. You're being punished for helping people who cannot help themselves, who are being killed, who are being murdered as a race by the Nazis. And you're not filled with hate. Instead, you're compelled to love people. Well, Corrie takes this message to heart, and she has to contend with the death of her sister and how she's not supposed to hate the Nazis for what they've done. Her last words, Betsy's last words to Corrie are these. She says, "There is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still." And eventually, Corrie is released from the prison camp. Turns out it was a clerical error. She wasn't supposed to be released, but she was. Just a week after that release, Corrie found out that all the women who were in that camp, they'd been taken to the gas chambers and executed. She was the only one who made it out alive. And what's Corrie going to do? Well, she's going to take the hope and the love of Christ and the forgiving, redemptive nature of his mercy in our lives, and she's going to go and she's going to tell that story. And so she begins this tour. She goes around to churches and communities, and she tells a story that she and Betsy lived and experienced. And she does this for years. Well, one day there's a man who shows up, and he's at the back of the church, and she recognizes this guy. It's been a while, but she recognizes him. And it turns out to be one of these prison guards who had been quite cruel, in fact, had beaten Betsy. And he comes up, and he puts out his hand, and he says, "I recognize you. I remember who you are. I've found Jesus, and he's changed my life. And I just want to say I'm sorry. Will you shake my hand?" And she says in that moment, there was not a single molecule in her body that wanted to shake his hand. She was filled with anger and rage. Her father had died. Her sister had died. Turned out her brother had also died in the resistance, and her nephew had died. The Nazis had taken so much. But she prays. And she said the Holy Spirit gave her the strength to put her hand out and shake his hand and forgive him. Right? What a picture of what it looks like to live in the upside down, but not play by the rules of the world as it is, but to be citizens of the kingdom. So, as we go from this week, I want you guys to think about that story. How can we reject the native instincts we have to be angry, to be selfish, to be vengeful, to be greedy, right? And how do we embrace the principles of Christ and live in a way that honors him, right? Thanks for coming this week. Hope you have a great day.